That's why I do really need a job at the moment, just so I can get funds and that, because the fucking dole ain't going to help, man.
No. What's the deal with the dole? What are they kind of saying?
It's £110 every 2 weeks, innit?
Right.
Just fucking balls, man.
That's not enough to live on.
No. Plus, the bank keep charging me as well because I need to pay my phone bill, but I can't pay my phone bill because I'm on the dole and I need that money to last for like 2 weeks. So that's why I've been going to Liverpool all the time, giving off CVs and just pestering people to give me a job. No, it's like people are going to hear like, oh, you're moaning about life, and it hasn't been that hard and that, but it has, because, like I said, most people have had a mum and dad. You know, my nan's brought me up since I was 2 years old, and I just want to pay her back at the end of the day. That's all I want to do right now, just pay people back.
We've got football and music all in the same place. And remember, this election is about you.
Birkenhead, on Merseyside, a region classified as one of the most depressed in Europe. In Birkenhead 20 years ago, there were over 14,000 jobs in the shipyards. Now there are 1,300. In those days, male unemployment of 45% in the area was unthinkable. Now it's fact.
Children in the streets of Birkenhead. For them, the prospects are bleak. Last year, 6 out of 7 school leavers couldn't get a job. Many have turned to heroin as an escape. For others, young and old, coping with unemployment means living off what the rest of us throw away. They're among the 13,000 out of work in Birkenhead. People who feel their prospects of work are so poor, they're on the scrap heap.
So you don't watch the news?
No, man.
Do you read newspapers?
No. Doesn't.
Look at stuff on the internet, like get onto anything there.
I used to watch like Zeitgeist and stuff. Do you know, that kind of interesting, like, I don't know, like conspiracies and things like that.
Yeah.
I don't watch the news and that. I'd rather, you know, watch something that's interesting to me and be like, oh, that's actually a good point. That could actually be real.
The entire money-structured and materialistic-oriented society is a false society.
There is no human nature. There's human behavior, and that's always been changed throughout history.
What we need is a true change of consciousness, where we understand the interrelationship between all of us.
Growing up in T Street nowadays means coming to terms with aimlessness.
It's as though the town has deteriorated, and now the kids are slowly but surely deteriorating with it.
Yeah.
You know, we're all on hooks, worrying about camelades. I mean, if that goes, it will just be a ghost town.
Yeah.
A ghost town.
When HMS Unicorn was handed over to the Navy in June 1993, 170 years of shipbuilding at Birkenhead went with it.
The town of Birkenhead, it was theirs, wasn't it? I mean, I don't think there's a family in Birkenhead or the Wirral Peninsula or even parts of Liverpool who haven't had somebody connected with camelades.
Mrs. Thatcher was determined to dismantle state control. Many in the loss-making nationalised industries would lose their jobs. Some industries, like shipbuilding, would shrink to a fraction of their former size.
The devastation that happened to those communities under Margaret Thatcher was remarkable, because within a very, very short period of time, something happened that had never been done to very large communities before. Mining, steel, and shipbuilding were devastated overnight, with no chance for any alternative to be introduced, no chance for retraining, no chance for shifting those communities towards something else.
Because of what Mrs. Thatcher and her policies and the people who deferred to her did to lots of people in this country who weren't really in a position to defend themselves, I have great difficulty in finding respect for her or for them.
To the Labour left, cutting subsidies to loss-making state industry was unforgivable. To Mrs. Thatcher, it was the first step to recovery.
And then, after doing all this, to do everything that Cammell Lairds requested you to do, and the men within the departments, to be just handed a letter one night and told to leave the yard by the end of the week is just incredible.
4 years ago, Mickey was in the same position as Alan is today. At 30, he'd worked all his life in ship repair, winning promotion to charge hand and leading a team of riggers. He remembers the crisis which unemployment caused.
You know, I just couldn't believe how I got the check on a Friday, or when I woke up Monday. I just couldn't believe he had nothing to do. So I just started going out, going to the pub, getting drunk in the afternoon. Every time I woke up, I just felt depressed all the time.
For the people of Liverpool and Birkenhead, the shipyard brought jobs, security and dignity. It was the heart of the community and a power in the land. However, it was Liverpool's misfortune in the 1980s to be on a political fault line that divided the nation.
Even before Labour came to power in Liverpool in 1983, there were ominous forebodings for the city in the form of leaked Whitehall memoranda. In 1981, Geoffrey Howe, then Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, used the term managed decline to describe the government's attitude towards Merseyside. It suggested that the government would play an instrumental role in this decline, and economic strangulation was thought to be the most efficient and convincing method of killing off the influence of Merseyside. An attritional approach would have all the outward signs of a natural decline in an area's former industrial prominence.
I don't have a computer. I have shit all, man. I've only got a guitar. That's the only thing that I own that's worth anything. I don't have a computer. Don't have any printing equipment. I tried to sort that out, didn't I? That didn't happen.
If I was on the dole and I'd seen that my family were not being adequately dressed, adequately fed, given a decent standard of living, I would work on the side without any hesitation whatsoever.
What are the drawbacks to doing that?
The drawbacks are that if you get caught, you could probably get dole stopped, or you could get sent to prison. But I think I am willing to take that chance because I am willing to work. They are defrauding me of the right to work.
It wasn't always so. Birkenhead once thrived.
The Queen goes to Merseyside, there to give a royal send-off to the world's most modern aircraft carrier, the Ark Royal.
Their Majesties, touring the north, were able by their presence to give the greatest encouragement to the many dockyard operatives whom they saw at work. And vital work it is, continuing day and night in spite of all Hitler's attempts to interrupt it.
1939. After the years of rehabilitation, it was war again, and Liverpool became the gateway to the western approaches. And this time it was a grim struggle for survival, a struggle kept alive by Britain's mastery of the seas, but a mastery that was challenged to its limits by the ruthlessness of the Luftwaffe and the German U-boats. And from a cellar in the shadow of the town hall operated the nerve center of the convoy system, which played its part against tremendous odds with the dogged courage that has always been associated with the merchant marine. Often these cargo ships were like sitting ducks for fast German raiders and U-boats, but still on they came. No fewer than 1,285 convoys arrived in Liverpool during the war, the largest consisting of well over 60 ships. Yet, despite the day and night bombing of the port by the Luftwaffe, besides the natural technical problems of coping with so many ships, there was no serious delay in docking them. At one time, there were as many as 60 ships outward and inward bound, lying at anchor at the bar.
The British Empire, the largest empire the world has ever known. For over 300 years, Britain ruled, its armies conquered, and its bankers proclaimed the might of its currency. But one day it all began to fall apart. One by one, countries declared their independence from Britain, and no amount of force could reverse the tide. As British elites saw their wealth, privileges, and empire disintegrate, they began to search for a new role in a changing world, and they found one in finance. This is a film about how Britain transformed from a colonial power to a modern financial power, and how this transformation has shaped the world we live in.
Gone are the sailors' doss houses, gone all the haunts of 100 years ago. All swept away in a city and port, shaping themselves for the challenge of the future.
On Australia's strand we soon will land, bully pubs he can look for me. I'll jump this ship in Melbourne town, go digging of the gold. There's a fortune found beneath the ground where the eucalyptus grows.
Labour. Sound never dies and the echoes still ripple over the river.
Way haul away, we'll haul away, Joe.
Music raucous or rhythmic, noisy or nostalgic. Songs of the Mersey, wafted and whistled from Sydney Heads to the Golden Gate.
Of course, these people here, they've had largely to make their own enjoyment, and one natural way of enjoying yourself is to sing. They are the secret people, I think, that Chesterton mentioned in his poem. There are no folk in the whole world so helpless or so wise. There is hunger in our bellies, there is laughter in our eyes. That's not true now of the hunger, but there's still the laughter in the eyes of these people around here and in their hearts.
Liverpool, the Mersey sound. A sound that means something different from what it did when Liverpool was just an important port. Because now, much to its surprise, the great northern city has got a new industry, as incongruous as the soot on its classical buildings. These are the Mersey Sound's pilgrims. Like it or not, this is the rich new market for music, if that's what you call it, and a whole new range of consumer goods that never could be sold before. And tonight, they're going to elect the new top guitar group that can make the music they appreciate. 1,000 groups all through the country competed for this honor. The Mersey beat was born of no particular social strata. It was as vibrant in the suburbs as it ever was in the congested areas of the city. It was no more than the expression of all the exuberance of youth.
Passengers leaving Liverpool for the American continent or arriving from across the Atlantic have a first-class hotel waiting for them in the Adelphi.
Well, I had the Liverpool tattoo convention, just chilling while my girlfriend gets a tattoo and that. And I don't know, it's like inspires me to like, basically I've always wanted to like do my own t-shirt company and that, so seeing people do art and what the styles are these days, like, just gives me inspiration to, you know, do my own kind of style. About Instagram and Facebook is basically you can start off small, just like with one t-shirt design, you know, start like hashtagging it and all that kind of crap. you know, just to get it well known. And like once you get like a few t-shirts sold and that, and like getting like, I don't know, basically it's all about like the people who you get to model for you. If they've got a certain style, like that's, they look at them people and they're like, I want to be like them kind of thing, which is, I don't know, it's not in a way you shouldn't want to be like anyone but yourself, but that's like a good incorporation really when you're selling t-shirts, to be like someone, and that's how they sell. So
a huge crowd welcomes Mr. Churchill to Liverpool as he comes to launch the Conservative election campaign.
By an effort of will, the enfeebling tendencies and fallacies of socialism, and free ourselves from socialist rule, and then to stand erect once more and take our place among the great powers of the world. Never shall we lose our faith and courage, and never shall we fail in exertion and resolve.
The militant tendency once ran the city of Liverpool. A group of only 7,000 revolutionary socialists, they infiltrated the Labour Party and orchestrated the anti-poll tax campaign. But by last year, Neil Kinnock had expelled most militants, including MPs Dave Nellist and Terry Fields. Their years of power over, Militant had to fight the general election alone and let the world see them as they really are.
They campaign for every brand of revolution, revolution in Ireland, revolution against the police, revolution in the family, revolution in the housing estates and in industry. Maggots, Mr. Kinnock, to use your word, but maggots don't infest healthy tissue. They get to work on corpses, and they ease their candidates into the marginal parliamentary seats, which Labour would have to win if it were ever to achieve a majority.
Do you regard yourself as a Marxist?
You know, people say Marxism dead, but now, as far as I'm concerned, this vicinity is like Eastern Europe used to be. Marxism still exists here.
Just Liverpool boys who fashioned something new in a sea of sound and insisted that the world listen. And the world listened. Cakes and calendars, diaries and dolls, the name Beatles has been branded onto almost every conceivable product. They've given rise to new patterns in teenage behavior. And through them, adolescents have found some outlet for the inhibitions and repressions of youth. For the first time in the history of popular entertainment, youth has produced its own idols out of the next street. Idols as tangible as the knockers on their own front doors.
Largely an appeal to the feminine heart, the heart of the young girl who worships love and the goddess of love and the heroes of love. And this plays the dominant part in her life, so that the vast majority of the fans are girls who come there to worship at the shrine of the goddess or the young god hero, as they did in the ancient past. I've seen this with the most dramatic intensity with the Beatles playing to 2,000 or 3,000 young girls in Manchester. Apart from another journalist, I was the only male in the audience. And I've never experienced anything like it in myself. If I were confronted with 10,000 Loch Ness monsters, I wouldn't be so impressed by this whistling and wailing and possession of the soul of these young girls.
Is there any need for alarm? Or should we continue to welcome these gods of the new age?
Group relations is the study of groups and the relationships between groups. And group, in our terms, here has to be clear, is not a small group of people in a room, 6 to 8 people in a room. A group can be an ethnic group, a professional group, a national group, a political group. It can be a work group, of course, in a company, but the concept of group is broader than just what you can see sitting in a room.
Arrive without traveling, see all without looking, do all without doing. When we took the notorious wonder drug LSD, it was we didn't know we were having it. John and I had this drug, and it was given. We were having dinner with our dentist, and he put it in our coffee and never told us. And we never heard of it. I mean, it's a good job we hadn't heard of it, because there's been so much paranoia created around the drug that people now, if they take it, they're already on a bad trip before they start. Whereas for us, we didn't know anything. We were so naive, and so we had it, and we went out to a club, and...
Let your heart beat for all life.
Radiate, swell, penetrate to the bumpy rhythm.
Really talking about mysticism, or are we talking about a technique of improving yourself, which is totally scientific and rational?
Take it either way. You can take it either way.
Well, that's easy.
This is because it is a perceptual method. If a man has got a great conceptual apparatus and he meditates, he will begin to understand the nature of a conceptual apparatus, and if he's wrong about it, he will begin to understand where he's wrong about it. If he's got no conceptual apparatus, he simply perceives an abstract experience.
Bleed to death. Lifeblood.
But if you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the rule. And this they will do partly by drugs, partly by these new techniques of propaganda. They will do it by bypassing the sort of rational side of man and appealing to his subconscious and his deeper emotions and his physiology even, and so making him actually love his slavery. I mean, I think this is the danger, that actually people may be in some ways happy under the new regime, but they will be happy in a situation where they oughtn't to be happy.
Liverpool playwright Alan Bleasdale's been explaining why he'd like to inflict political GBH on the Conservative Party during a trip to the city by Glenys Kinnock.
The people out the militants and that, it's not just politics, although we are, serious about politics and what's going on. But we all go out together, we go to nightclubs, we have parties, have people around me. My best friends are involved in the tendency. We're just like really a family in that. You can always rely on the people and that.
Lead militants, defend the NHS, special articles on Liverpool today. Lead the militants.
Obviously I read the Militant newspaper every week. I read political books, particularly on issues like women's issues, which I'm particularly interested in. I like novels, I like magazines, I like reading the Cosmopolitan, that's one of my favourites.
I think it's the Blue Transit just coming in.
Yeah, he's pulled into the loading bay.
Are they still in the van, mate?
Yeah, they're still sitting inside it.
Okay, I mean, that's unusual. I can't answer that. We just have to hang out and see where they go.
The militants are conducting surveillance on bailiffs' vans, planning to give chase and stop them carrying out repossessions.
Yeah, mate? Eddie. Hello.
You name them, whatever you want to call them. And that there is the window that I actually banged and banged on. I thought she was dead.
So do you want to come in and have a look at this place? Right.
Be careful now.
Right, be careful.
Have your belly up, babe. They got in 11 times in 8 weeks. They battered her up. She was unconscious on the couch. They stripped the 3 lights I put up for her, what Lottie in the shop gave me. They smashed the toilet up, they took the sink, they took the copper pipe, and you name it, they took it. They left her with nothing. I mean, she didn't have anything to begin with, but they left her with zilch.
And they expected her to come back
and live in this hellhole.
And it wasn't just her, you know, that's what we're not to forget here. It wasn't just Jeanette, she was pregnant. Yeah. How can you expect to send a pregnant woman back to, it was a slum anyway, but it was ripped out, it's a ripped out slum. And what they actually said was, tough shit, go back, live there, there's nothing we're going to do for you. But Joan Brown wouldn't accept that, and neither would Nancy, and that's why Jeanette's where she is now, you know.
And that's why I've got a lovely little granddaughter for now.
I know what I've done. I joined the militants, along with Nancy and other people like me, because there was nowhere else to go. I'm a Labour Party member. Whether there will be after this programme or not, I don't know. But the fact is that I went to the official Labour Party, and they didn't want to know.
First time in a great war, there was no front line, and the battle was waged on our own doorsteps. The Luftwaffe did its worst, with inhuman success. In the May Blitz alone, 3,966 people in the 4 Merseyside boroughs lost their lives, and 3,812 are seriously injured. 10,000 of their homes were completely destroyed, and 184,000 damaged. A catastrophe from which it would seem almost impossible to recover.
No. You've got fields all right over the back. You can't see them here for the grown-ups to play football on a Sunday. But there's no places for children to play. These councillors up here and the health, the welfare and all that, they don't give a damn.
It's for children, not stopped you. I've taken someone. After the first 12 months I was up here, I took tablets. And I had to go in Walton Hospital and get my stomach pumped.
You're always worrying. You're living on edge all the while. You're worrying about what's going to happen next. You don't know what's going to happen next. But that psychological effect is always there to a person living there, to anyone who lives in these flats.
The bureaucracy was charged with producing the epic monuments to Stalin's era. At a time during the 1930s when the capitalist world was gripped by recession and the growth of fascism, the images of Soviet modernization, education and welfare appealed to many in the West as an attractive alternative. Stalin claimed, of all the treasures a state can possess, the human lives of its citizens are for us the most precious.
Everyone who lives there, and especially over here, this girl here up here.
She's an able spread up here, and the children have been sick from the foul smell from the drains and everything. I'm only up here 4 months, I've no home of my own, and I've looked here for the comfort, but there's none here. Only filth. No chance of getting an exchange, no chance of a transfer, they tell you you're here for life.
Of this lunchtime, your behaviour in the classroom where you've sworn at members of staff, grown up. Would you? Well, when are you going to grow up then, Michael? Hey? When are you going to grow up? Well, perhaps you don't know the answer to that yet, Michael. Perhaps it is a difficult question. But let me tell you here and now is that you need to grow up pretty fast. And part of growing up is realising that when you're given good advice, you take it, Michael.
You're a working class person, you're trying to give in a middle class ideology. It's ridiculous. It's a contradiction to be told when you go into school that if you sit down and do your lessons and you abide by law and order and you do as you're told, that eventually that you're going to be all clean and smiling and rosy when a poor bloody kid gets back home and there's 5 or 6 of them stuck in a bleeding pissed up bed. If they send a careers officer along, then they should send a dole officer along with them to say, in the event that you don't get one of these fantastic careers, this is the place you'll have to come to, where we'll give you a card and you'll sign on once every week. Not telling them what fantastic careers that they can have if only that they do the right things and obey the right rules. At 15 years of age, when they leave school, they discover that the outside world isn't what they were taught when they were in school. Because they land up as factory fodder, in factories and in dead-end jobs. If it was equal opportunities and equal job opportunities like they're taught in school, it'd be Christ of the middle classes and the ruling classes, because who the bloody hell would run them bloody factories and produce the bloody wealth that they owed?
Worn-out hulks are broken up for scrap in an area where great ships were once proudly built. If some of Robbie's friends now feel themselves to be on the scrap heap, it's not for want of trying to do better.
I've known quite a few of my mates to go down to the job centre every single day, and all they've got is interviews. They've got to be either 18 or the other jobs you've got to be brainy. You know what I mean? And some of them, you know, they're not daft. Some of them have got brains, but they just can't get the jobs.
Robbie Wilde and 2 other T Street teenagers are working, together with Danny Doyle, the blind man. But out of 32 households, no householder has a job. And in nearly every house, there is at least one man or woman of working age without work.
I think I can't get a job at the moment because politics and that is kind of like saying, oh, if you've got a beard and tattoos and piercings and that, you don't fit into what we want in our world. We want you to wear a suit and tie and that, go to work and sit on a computer all day. That's basically what they want, isn't it? They want a harm, but I like the free life too much, and I want to be free.
I left school at the age of 15 and a half. Rough comprehensive school. I went to work in a factory alongside with many of my classmates. We worked there for 2 years in different factories. And at the age of 19 and a half, I got married. I have 2 children, a boy and a girl. I am now 25.
And following Lenin, he claimed the party plus electrification equals communism.
В настоящий момент мы даем 3500 в смену ламп. Это много. Но комсомолец ставит своей задачей догнать и перегнать Америку. Дать смену 7000 ламп. Этого мы добьемся. Мы настолько овладели техникой, что выпустили свою техническую книгу под названием «Как делается электролампочка». Читайте ее. А работу бригады вы увидите сейчас.
In the language of consumption, objects take on a kind of magical significance of their own. We are the products of a new consciousness industry, buying not just goods but identities. Money becomes the universal language of human relations. Fundamentally, the capitalism that Marx wrote about a century ago remains intact. Capital still commands the forces of production. It harnesses and hires labor power. It secures the raw materials for production. It develops and implements new technologies. It reaches out to ever-expanding world markets, maximizing profits, knocking out competitors, centralizing on a world scale. Behind the dynamism and productiveness of capitalism, Marx saw the appalling conditions it offered to working men and women, living cramped in overcrowded tenements with open sewers, crippled by hunger, illness and debt, and by the constant fear of unemployment, slumps and crises of capitalism. Marx believed that the experience of capitalism would begin to unify the proletariat as a class. He wrote, "With the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows and it feels that strength more." Marx believed that the workers would increasingly abandon attempts at compromise and reform. They would challenge the capitalist system through trade unions and political parties. These industrial and political struggles would produce a class-conscious labor movement that would finally overthrow capitalism.
We've been building houses, which never happened before, for 10 years before that, when the Liberals were in. They didn't even build a house. But these people are trying to build houses and making things better for everybody all around. Building houses is building jobs, isn't it? And apart from building houses, they've made parks and things like that, you know. They haven't made an effort. I mean, when the war was finished, the place got bombed and smashed down. And the government should have built all them then, but they never did it. So now they're doing it off their own back.
Everybody understood that the consequences of taking on the establishment mean the establishment throw everything they've got at you. So certainly I don't think there's a single person in the Labour group who wasn't aware of the possible consequences.
Fundamental change, rather than a tinkering at the social margins, was demanded. And when Labour councillors pledged to build houses, create jobs, freeze rents, and not levy large rate increases to compensate for Tory cuts, they received a massive mandate at the polls. Such policies in Tory Britain in 1983 were nothing short of revolutionary.
We were left in a position where either we went into the business of cutting jobs and not building houses and reducing the service considerably, or we said we're not prepared to do that, we're prepared to go along the line, which would inevitably mean that we came into conflict with the government.
But if local Labour politicians were expected to not rock the boat, like so many of their subservient predecessors, Mrs. Thatcher had not reckoned with the fighting spirit of Liverpool people. But the Tories were equally determined that such a revolution in local government should not take place. They understood that a successful Liverpool City Council, carrying out such radical policies as they were elected on, would open the floodgates of demands from every socially depressed city across the UK.
Hidden within its sometimes forbidding prose is the promise of revolution. It was a starting point for a chain of ideas that have inspired a world movement.
With the decline of empire, British commercial interests across the globe were under threat. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal.
A new Middle East crisis arises as President Nasser of Egypt tells a wildly cheering crowd in Alexandria that Egypt has seized the internationally owned Suez Canal. France and Britain issue a 12-hour ultimatum. Within hours of its expiration, Britain's warplanes are winging their way to Egypt, and its bombers attack 5 key cities, including Cairo.
The United States was opposed to the invasion and put pressure on Britain and France to withdraw their troops.
There will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities. It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly. There, the opinion of the world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem.
Britain was humiliated. The Suez Crisis signified the end of Britain's role as one of the world's major powers.
Well-wishers besiege Caxton Hall, London, for the wedding of Britain's popular Foreign Secretary, Mr. Anthony Eden, to Miss Clarissa Spencer Churchill.
In the post-war period, the Tory party was still run by the upper classes.
Macmillan's best example, Alec Douglas, Hume, Eden, these were people from very posh backgrounds.
The upper-class Tory establishment agreed with Labour socialists that the state should directly control much of the economy. This was called the post-war consensus. The extent of nationalisation under both Labour and Tory governments was breathtaking. The ports and the docks and shipbuilding were nationalised. The trains and the railways, freight transport, canals, ferries and buses were nationalised. The airports and airlines, car, bus, truck and airplane manufacturing, the coal industry, the oil industry, the gas industry, the steel industry, iron, water, electricity were all nationalised. Telecommunications were nationalised. Much of the computer industry, radio and television were nationalised. The government even took over some pubs and the travel agent Thomas Cook. Britain, once the world's leading capitalist industrial nation, became one of the most state-owned of any country outside the communist world.
I'm singing a song of freedom. Back then, freedom meant not just liberation from the Nazis, but also from the economic chaos and uncertainty that had caused the depression of the 1930s. Governments now believed that their role was to manage and control the economy and protect society from the dangerous self-interest at the heart of capitalism. Why can't we?
No longer did we worship at the shrine of no-holds-barred capitalism. No, we had been through the Depression of the 1930s. We had been through World War II. Now we were talking about the need for government to be the major balancing element in the economy. The individual was still important, but government would make sure that we would never slide into a deep depression again.
In the following years, the bureaucracies at the heart of the state grew enormously. Their job was to regulate capitalism for the benefit of everyone. In an age of optimism, there were few who challenged this new vision. But one man on the margins was convinced it would lead to disaster. He was an Austrian aristocrat called Friedrich von Hayek, who had fled the Nazis and now taught at the University of Chicago. Hayek was convinced that the use of politics to plan society was far more dangerous than any problems produced by capitalism, because it inevitably led to tyranny and the end of freedom. The terrible example that Hayek pointed to was the Soviet Union. In their search for a utopia, the Soviet leaders had tried to plan and control everything, but this had led them into tyranny and dictatorship. The same would now inevitably happen to the West, he said. It was on what he called the road to serfdom.
The Bolsheviks seized power in the first successful revolution, claiming inspiration from Marx's ideas. Under conditions of severe Tsarist repression, the Bolsheviks had forged a tightly disciplined, centralized, secretive revolutionary party which spread Marx's ideas throughout the Russian workers' movement. Their leader was Lenin, and like Marx himself, he argued that a Russian revolution would only survive if it was part of an international revolution. He claimed, "We are now in a besieged fortress waiting for the other detachments of the world socialist revolution to come to our relief." The conventional wisdom has it that this world revolution never materialized, and therefore Marx was wrong. But in fact, during the years following World War I, Marx's predictions came within a hair's breadth of succeeding. Even Britain, the center of European stability, was closer to revolution than at any time in this century. There were tanks on the streets of London, troops encircling Glasgow, where the red flag flew on the town hall. There were little Moscows in the Ronda, strikes on the railways and in the mines, dockers refusing to load arms for the war against Soviet Russia, coupled with the threat of a general strike. In an amazingly short space of time, the Bolsheviks shaped a Red Army from an undisciplined, backward peasantry.
Its organizer was the war commissar, Trotsky. This army took on a vastly superior force, and against all expectations, they won.
From this dispute, it's often said that you learn far more in 5 minutes of struggle than you do in 20 years of reading.
What we've said is that when we return to power, that we want to see socialist managers of the local authority. As far as we're concerned, there is no position within the career structure for those people who've shown themselves to be very anti-trade union and have no real concern for the people of this city and for the employees. And if that means a degree of positive discrimination, if that means that certain people are going to suffer, well, so be it.
If they gain power, parliamentary democracy would disappear. They may gain power through parliamentary democracy by using the Constitution. But once they go in power, we'd have a one-party state.
But criticism of militants' aims doesn't only come from the right or from the SDP. Frank Field, the left-wing Labour MP for Birkenhead, has grave doubts about militants' long-term faith in parliamentary democracy.
This is the rub. Is militant using democracy as a tactic, or do they believe it? Now, I believe it, and that's why one suffers defeats and one comes back and tries to fight from a basis of defeat to convince people. If, for example, one had militant winning the Labour Party, how many of us would survive in it much longer? I mean, leaving apart the fact that some would leave, would we not actually face expulsions very quickly, just as at University College the various Trotskyite factions dubbed the Tribunite students there as closet SDPers who should be drummed out the party because the Trotskyites are in the majority. That's what's waiting for us. That's what the British voter smells and doesn't like it.
They don't see policies as ones that will be implemented. They're policies that are, in their language, there to raise consciousness. They're very directly derived from Trotsky's theory of the transitional demand. It's quite simple. You put forward a demand that seems okay, but which can't actually be realised under a capitalist system. So that people get drawn into the campaign for these demands. Capitalism can't deliver the goods, so therefore they become socialists, and they therefore start demanding an insurrectionary change from capitalism to socialism, which is very different from that of the traditional Labour left that don't see change to socialism coming through insurrection, through a sudden overnight coup or whatever.
Across the Northwest and North Wales on 96.7, this is City FM.
The Prime Minister has ended the phony war by confirming that the general election will be on April the 9th.
Terry Fields, 9 years Labour MP for Liverpool Broad Green, has been expelled for militant links. He now has to stand as an independent socialist. Travelling to address council tenants in his constituency, he'll tell them how he takes only half his Westminster salary, giving the rest to socialist causes.
The important thing is this. I'm not in it for personal gain. It's a couple of my fire brigade comrades over there. I still live, as you know, on a firefighter's rate of pay. And I know what needs to be done on behalf of all of us if we're going to have a better future for the young and for the old alike. Stand firm, be resolute, be encouraged that eventually we'll see the change in society. I'm struggling on your behalf. I can only do it with you. Thanks very much indeed.
We're acquainted with the ideas of militant is because of our programme. We support all the reforms in Labour's programme. A 35-hour week without loss in pay. A massive programme of public works. But we say that the next Labour government must nationalise not every grocer's shop, but the 200 monopolies that control 80 to 85% of the economy and introduce a socialist plan of production. If it doesn't do that, unfortunately, the next Labour government can create the disillusionment that the last Labour government created. That's why we lost the general election in 1979.
Possible supporters of other parties who would be attracted to the Labour Party because of the government's record and are being kept away from that because of the operation of what they see as an undemocratic group. Because the Labour Party is a democratic socialist party that believes in change through Parliament. Militant is a Trotskyist organisation that does not. They believe in revolutionary organisations based on the model of the Communist Party in the Russian Revolution, and they despise democracy. Now, in a democratic society, they have a right. They have a right to set up that sort of body. They have a right to form their own party and to put it to the electorate and get the same sort of derisory votes that those sort of parties have always achieved on their own account. They do not have the right, as Austin said, to be parasites inside the Labour Party.
The barrier between communism and democracy was torn down symbolically yesterday when East Germany opened its borders to immigration and travel, but today, sections of the wall are being knocked down physically, not just by kids, but by soldiers of East Germany as well as citizens.
In today's Russia, Lenin is becoming an unperson. His statue, which once had pride of place in the Kremlin, has been banished to a remote corner of the Gorky estate. Communists no longer have the power to shape history to suit the party line. In recent years, facts about Lenin, long forgotten, long suppressed, have been coming to light. Until the collapse of communism, they lay buried here in the Central Party archives. Only a handful of trusted party historians were allowed access to Lenin's secret files.
50 million people died in wars, mass slaughter, and political murders. The ideology known as communism bears the greatest responsibility for this terrible savagery. This is an ideology that promises so-called equality and justice, but which brings with it only bloodshed, death, and fear. In this film, we shall be examining the bloody century of communism and seeing the terrible misery this ideology inflicted on humanity. It will be impossible for the world to avoid similar tragedies in the future unless it learns from the past.
World War II. Nazis are killing civilians. It was called the sardine method. Victims laid in layers, like sardines in a jar. An effective way to exterminate many people in a short time. But this film will not be about the Nazis. Hands tied behind the back. An expertly aimed shot in the neck. And the fall into a huge mass grave. These people were not killed by the Nazis. They were killed by one of the Allies, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was killing people in this way for many years, both before and after it joined the Allies. These victims had no memorials. They were buried in anonymous mass graves. The murderous power that killed them and the powers that collaborated with the murderer were never actually prepared to talk about them. The memory of millions of innocent victims was erased from history. Youth throughout the world likes to make jokes using popular symbols of the past. While the Nazi swastika is considered to be a bad joke, Soviet symbols are not. Communism, after all, was not Nazism. It was about equality and harmony. There was nothing wrong with the idea itself. Well, actually, there was. There was something which made it different from the other utopias. Lenin believed in what he called the war of classes, which meant that the ultimate harmony can only be reached after certain groups of people are killed.
Part of the left went to Hitler, at least in France. Part of the socialists went to become advocates of Hitler.
The popular British playwright Bernard Shaw supported Hitler in the mass media. The left supported Hitler not because he deceived them. They knew Hitler would kill. He said he would. In fact, it was why they supported him.
You must all know half a dozen people at least who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. Just put him there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social vote, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
Bernard Shaw believed in mass killing by category, not usually by racial category, but by category, you know, the idle, the unfit.
Killing off the parasites within society was what Marxian socialism was about.
It demanded in a London newspaper that the scientists should devise a humane gas.
I appeal to the chemists to discover a humane gas that will kill instantly and painlessly. Deadly by all means, but humane, not cruel. After 10 years, such gas will be discovered. It will be called Cyclone B. The man who oversaw its practical application, Adolf Eichmann, will later testify that thanks to Cyclone B, people in Auschwitz died without pain. Cyclone B was a humane gas. Yes, Eichmann will use the very same words. It must be said, though, that Bernard Shaw, as well as the left in general, fundamentally opposed Nazism, because Hitler had distorted Marxism beyond recognition. Gassing people based on their nationality was absolutely inexcusable. The selection should be based on class. Hitler got it all wrong. Absolutely different people needed to be killed.
They think it's attractive to offer to the young a future wholly controlled by the operation of the socialist state. What is their message? To each his own pigeonhole, from each total conformity. We utterly reject it.
In 1975, Mrs. Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party, and Buchanan's ideas had a powerful influence on her and the group of radicals gathered around her. A right-wing think tank advising Mrs. Thatcher brought James Buchanan to London for a series of seminars, and he explained starkly why the British state was failing. It was pure game theory. Because there was no agreed version of the public good, the bureaucrats and the politicians schemed and strategized in their own self-interest, building up their power and their own empires. They claimed to be helping others. In fact, it was the very opposite, and the result was economic chaos and a breakdown of society. The only way of avoiding disaster was to go back into the past, back to a golden age of the free market, where individuals followed their own self-interest and government played little or no role. Out of this would come what Hayek called a self-directing automatic system, a spontaneous order created by millions of people pursuing their own gain.
We will benefit our fellow men most if we are guided solely by the striving for gain. For this purpose, we have to return to an automatic system which brings this about, self-directing automatic system which alone can restore to liberty and prosperity. That is my fundamental conception.
Isn't it a philosophy based essentially on selfishness? What about altruism? Where does that come in?
It doesn't come in.
Hayek's ideas were dismissed by politicians and economists. The notion that one could create social order in a modern complex world simply by unleashing individual self-interest was seen as a failed and discredited idea. But proof that he might be right was about to emerge from the most unlikely of sources, from scientists struggling with the new, terrifying uncertainties of the Cold War.
The equilibrium, this equilibrium which is used, is that what I do is perfectly adjusted in relation to what you are doing. And what you're doing, or what any other person is doing, is perfectly adjusted to what I'm doing or what all other people are doing. They are seeking separate optimization, just like poker players.
Is each player alone?
That's the idea, that they are alone, they're separate. Doing something that is very non-cooperative, but very selfish. And then what all of them do works together, and deriving from that, there is a payoff to all the players. That is the equilibrium. But it's understood not to be a cooperative ideal.
But the stability, the equilibrium, would only happen if everyone involved behaved selfishly. Because if they cooperated, the result became unpredictable and dangerous. A famous game was developed at Rand to show that in any interaction, selfishness always led to a safer outcome.
The young people, the likes of you, and possibly a lot of you are a little bit young to start thinking in terms of a hate the police relationship, but in a few years' time, there's no doubt about it, you'll start forming ideas. And it's our job today, and in the coming weeks and months, to try and break this possible barrier, or prevent this barrier from building up. Now, a lot of young people today hate the police or detest the police purely and simply because they get into trouble. They get into lumber. And one of the few things that you can help yourselves in trying to avoid coming into contact with the police, it's a very, very simple remedy if you think about it. Anybody, if you know somebody's done something wrong, for God's sake, tell somebody. Tell somebody. That is either in school, your teachers. Out in the street, if you see a policeman, tell him.
As you might expect in an isolated society like Liverpool 8, group leaders tend to emerge. Delroy Burris is a self-employed builder. Although he rejects the title of community leader, he is in fact a counsellor to the younger, less mature men in the Granby area. He's fit, wiry, intelligent and articulate. His nature is mercurial. When he talks about the police, he seems to find it hard to contain his temper.
This community has gone through too much racial harassment in this society, even as black British, too much economic deprivation. And now, in 85, our youth have become politically aware. They fought in 81 on the streets and beat the enemy, which was the police front, because they were there to oppress the black community. I mean, you see pictures on South Africa, the way the police used to go in and work it to the black people, you know, with whips and everything. Let me tell you, before 81, the scene wasn't much different in Liverpool 8.
If there was just you and your mate in a room which was burning, and there was only one way of escape, and there was only chance of one person to get out of that room, believe you me, your mate wouldn't think about you. They'd kick you in the teeth and say, I'm all right, Jack, I'm getting out. When your mate's shoplifting, think of number one. Think of the room that's burning. Would she or would I get out of that room?
And once you've got that answer, then you'll know what to do. Think of yourselves. Report it. And in a lot of cases, you're helping your friend. To put you in a picture what may happen to you, we'll go on to the punishment side of it. Detention centre, 3 months, short and sharp. But believe you me, the detention centre isn't very nice because you're away from home. Your day is ruled from the moment you start to the moment you finish. That's the attendance centre. You can then be placed into care, which means that for an unspecified length of time, probably until you are 18, you will remain in the care of the local authority. Now, there are certain boys and girls in this school who are in care of the local authority, and they're in care but still attending school purely and simply because all the approved schools, community homes are full. But their turn will come. As soon as a vacancy arrives, they are sent away into care, which means that they are unruly, unfit to live in the town that they are living in. Therefore, they've got to be sent away to a different home, to a different environment.
But there was a small problem with Nash's equations. They didn't seem to correlate with how human beings actually behave towards each other in the real world. When the prisoner's dilemma game was tested out on the secretaries of the RAND Corporation, none of them played the rational strategy. Instead of betraying each other, they always trusted each other and decided to cooperate. And what no one realised was that John Nash himself was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. He had delusions in which he believed that those around him who wore red ties were communist spies, and that he was part of a secret organisation that could save the world.
From the 1960s onwards, City of London institutions began to establish offshore branches in former outposts of the British Empire. Their aim was to create offshore centres with strong secrecy legislation in order to attract capital from across the globe. With access to large amounts of offshore money, the euro market grew rapidly. By 1980, it had reached $500 billion. By 1988, $4.8 trillion. And by 1997, nearly 90% of all international loans were made through this market. The British Empire had sunk, leaving hardly a trace behind. But the City of London adapted and survived. It is run by an organisation called the City of London Corporation, a private company that performs all the functions of a local council with a private police force and private courts.
By the 1970s, state-owned Britain was on its knees, outdated and overmanned. The nationalised industries were making huge losses. They were not producing wealth, they were consuming it. Britain, once the workshop of the world, was now the sick man of Europe.
I think you're scared. I think because there won't be so much opposition, you don't know whether you're doing the right thing or not.
If you don't want me to answer, I'll go home. It's a lovely evening. I don't need to be here. But if you do want me to answer, I will stay.
Please, will you give the...
As the British economy spiralled out of control, the political and bureaucratic elite who had dominated Britain since the war found themselves under attack from both the right and the left. Where once they had been heroic figures who would create a new world, now they were accused of being agents of control, not freedom.
We've been ruled by men who live by illusions. The illusion that you can have freedom by government decree.
And these new theories began to spread into the public imagination.
"20 years ago this summer, flared trousers and Saturday night fever were in. The economy, if not exactly booming, was in better shape than for some time. Labour supporters were cautiously optimistic about winning the next election. But then, in a few short months, all their hopes were dashed. A devastating series of strikes brought the country to a halt and changed the face of British politics forever.
With people sitting round braziers, it looked on television to the country as if the revolution had begun.
Fighting for, you can stop your 5%, cause that won't pay the rent. And it's 5, 6, 7, picket in the factory gate. It's 1 in the eye for Sonny Jim, whoopee, we're going to win.
After 3 weeks, Ford had lost over £20 million. The Ford settlement burst the wage policy dam, and the unions flooded in with demands for huge pay increases. In December, oil tanker drivers banned overtime in support of their demand for a 40% rise. Images of petrol queues and closed service stations filled the news reports. But what worried the government more was the threat to industry and essential services. At the Cabinet Office, they activated the Civil Contingencies Unit, or CCU, a body of ministers, civil servants and the military, which is called in times of national crisis. Troops were put on standby and trained to take over the tanker drivers' jobs. The plan was called Operation Drumstick, but before it could be put into effect, a national state of emergency would have to be declared. Summoned to Downing Street to discuss the crisis. The government, using the only weapon they had left, once again threatened to use troops if essential goods weren't moved. As this union document shows, it worked.
To prevent intervention of emergency powers, we would recommend to strike committees that to ensure that troops are not used, they accept these priorities.
The priorities for transport included animal feedstuffs and pharmaceuticals. But whatever the union leaders agreed with the government, on the ground it was the local shop stewards who decided who got what by way of essential supplies. They set up what they rather grandly called dispensation committees.
The dispensation committee was lorry drivers. Yesterday, they was driving a lorry for a living. Today, they're controlling the movements of essential goods. And the governments are talking about bringing in a Transport Act because essential goods were being prohibited from being moved around the country. So the seriousness of that, planted into 5 ordinary lorry drivers, was immense.
It was us poor bastards took the chop when the tube's gone up and the buses stopped. Top folks still come out on top. The government never resigned.
On January the 22nd, 1.5 million public service employees staged a day of action in support of £60 minimum wage for the low paid. There was now no hiding place for the government, because in this dispute, they themselves were the employers. As schools were shut down and the railwaymen went on strike, their battered policy faced its ultimate test.
I think it stinks like all the other damn strikes in this country run by the filthy socialist communist unions.
Despite the pain of economic reform, Mrs. Thatcher's election victory in 1983 was the most decisive since the Second World War.
For Mrs. Thatcher, triumph was sweet, and she chose to share it with some of the people who'd given her a landslide victory.
A larger victory than I had ever dared to hope.
The Labour vote fell again, this time by 3 million. Labour's share of the working class vote dropped even further. It was the worst result for Labour since 1900, when the party was founded. Even among trade unionists, almost as many were now voting Tory as were voting Labour.
We have been treated with contempt.
Incensed by trade union reform and the threatened closure of loss-making pits, Arthur Scargill, the militant mine union leader, decided to take action. He tried and failed 3 times to win a strike ballot. In the end, he called a strike without one, and he organised a small army of flying pickets in an effort to cut the supply of coal to the power plants.
French missiles, including pieces of fencing, were being thrown at the police.
Our duty demands and the national interest requires that we see that violence does not pay and is seen not to pay.
The pickets knew what to expect. They'd been warned it could turn nasty, and it did.
It was a trial of strength between Mrs. Thatcher and Arthur Scargill.
Get in here to see what they're doing.
Scargill ended up in hospital.
Police said he'd fallen and hurt himself. Mr. Scargill had a different version.
All I know is that these bastards rushed in and this guy hit me up back at head with a bloody shield and knocked me to the ground out.
And it was then that it started to dawn on us that there was people out there who were trying to kill us. There was genuine fear, and that's what they felt. You know, there's people out there. If I fall over now, someone is going to kill me.
Merseyside police, overwhelmed from the start by the ferocity of the attacks, including rioters driving a mechanical digger, sent for reinforcements from neighbouring forces. They fared little better.
I collapsed to the floor. The police just grabbed me by two arms and dragged me like 300 yards and threw me in the back of a police van.
Paul Conroy's back was broken in this incident. Police armed with pump-action shotguns were now seen on the streets of Toxteth. In addition, for the first time outside Northern Ireland, tear gas was fired against civilian rioters. No warnings were issued. By the end of 3 days of rioting, Toxteth was devastated. – 150 buildings had been destroyed. Nearly 800 police were injured. There had been over 500 arrests, with more than 1,000 reported crimes. Lord Scarman's inquiry into the Brixton riot was widened to take in Toxteth and other riot-torn areas. The government was feeling vulnerable. The council employed a Londoner, Sam Bond, as their principal race relations advisor. Bond's support for militants' position on race immediately brought him into conflict with local black groups. Within 2 years, the council's leadership was no longer on speaking terms with most of the black organizations in Toxteth.
We were concerned that the black issue didn't become more important than the, if you like, the class issue that we believed in at the time. And I think that we went over the top on that. We had an idea who we wanted, and the Black Caucus had an idea of what they wanted. We unfortunately went along our line. We caused a split and a division, which was the most unhelpful thing that could have been possible at that moment in time. And if there was one sort of tactical error that if I had my time over again I would change, it would be the appointments of Sam Bond.
By the time of the general election on the 3rd of May, the strikes had petered out. But the damage, both to Labour and the power of the unions, was irretrievable.
Here comes the Prime Ministerial rover, bearing now Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister.
The winter of discontent brought down the Labour government. Without the winter of discontent, we would have gone on to October, and we might well have gone back with a small majority or the largest single party. We wouldn't have been shattered in the way we were. It started off a chain of events which put the Labour Party out of power for nearly 20 years and also made the Labour Party stand on its head about its ideology.
If militant take over, they're a totally undemocratic organisation, though they're working within the constitution, we'll have a one-party state.
So the charge is that a militant-controlled Labour government would not accept being voted out of office.
That's entirely untrue, because on the basis of our programme, we want a 35-hour week, a £90 minimum wage, full employment, a massive expenditure on the social services and so on. It wouldn't be necessary. Who would vote against a government of that sort, which within 10 years, on the basis of microelectronics and so on, would be entirely possible to have a standard of living for every family of about £200 a week and working 4 or 5 hours a week? That's according to capitalist scientists themselves, if the resources are used. At this moment, only 70% of the productive capacity of the country is being used. Even to use 100% of productive capacity could mean an extra 50 or 60 pounds a week to every family in the country. Now, if you carried out a programme of that sort and at the same time nationalise the press so that everyone has access to the media in proportion to their votes in the election, how could there wouldn't be any question of being voted out. If we were voted out, if the electorate were mad enough to vote us out under those conditions, it would be impossible, we would accept it. But it's clear that we wouldn't be voted out, because all the
programme mightn't work.
It would work. Why? There's absolutely no reason why the programme shouldn't work. If we take over the economy, then it's entirely possible to plan the society. And once you take over the economy, it'll be entirely possible to improve the conditions of the mass of the population to such an extent that it's very unlikely that there would be a counter-revolution, if you like.
But I'm not talking about counter-revolution. I'm talking about the ballot box voting out a government if it feels that it hasn't succeeded in achieving its objectives.
Well, then we would accept that, but we can't see that our objectives could not be achieved.
And you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real needs, and you end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council hiring taxis to scuttle around the city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers. I'm telling you, no matter how entertaining, how fulfilling the short-term egos, I tell you, and you listen, I'm telling you, you can't play politics with people's jobs and with people's services.
We could bring the conference to order.
We bring the conference to order, if you think. Thank you. Thank you. If I could bring conference to order, please. I've always secretly wanted to be conference chair.